Thank you very much, Jan. I'm also very pleased to be here and would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and acknowledge their elders past and present. And I'd like to thank Toby very much. I learnt a lot. I want to say at the outset that I'm not an expert on killer robots. I mentioned that when I was asked to give this talk this evening. No expert on that specific subject, but what I'll do is to say a little about some of the issues that Toby has raised, and as I mentioned, I learned a lot from Toby's talk and agree with comments that he's made. But I will put this issue also in a slightly broader context of warfare and other weapon systems, and I'm also going to say a bit about the issue of Australia generally and warfare, which is slightly off topic, but I think it's very relevant. So what we're talking about with killer robots is delegating to machines the functions of deciding which people will be killed and where and how they will be killed, and all with very little meaningful human input into these decisions. So machines, not any human operator, would make life and death decisions. And as Toby has indicated, that lack of human control has led human rights and legal commentators to call for a ban on the development, the production and the use of fully autonomous weapons. So one of the issues that's raised is about the erosion of human dignity by autonomous weapons in times of warfare. Now that might sound like a pretty ridiculous thing to say, that there is in fact any human dignity in warfare, because warfare is pretty barbaric activity at the best of times. But nevertheless, there are rules that apply to warfare, and they're very important rules that uphold humane values, such as the protection of non-fighters, non-combatants, a prohibition on inflicting disproportionate suffering, and the humane treatment of prisoners of war, and other rules that apply to warfare. So even though these principles that are built into international humanitarian law are regularly violated, it's still critical that the principles are upheld and, if anything, strengthened rather than abandoned. And in civil society, we don't abandon laws just because criminals violate them. So when humans are removed from the decision-making process, there's removal of the capacity for reason, judgment, the application of moral principles, and there's removal of human empathy, which can in fact act as a check on killing. And all of these things rely on much more than the analysis of data. So to allow weapons that by their very nature remove a critical restraint on the killing process, which is the human interaction, to allow these weapons, then human dignity in warfare is in fact further eroded, and the capacity for error is increased. Now, the issue of distinguishing combatants from civilians, or distinguishing combatants from, for example, soldiers who are surrendering, is fundamental to the laws that apply to warfare. And this often requires human judgment, sometimes by the detection of very subtle clues that a machine would not detect, or perhaps by the use of past experience on the part of the soldier, past experience with other humans, picking up clues. But with autonomous weapons, there's no potential to intervene on the basis of such subtle last-minute clues to prevent harm being done. And as Toby mentioned, I also will mention some other weapon systems where the inability to distinguish civilians from combatants has been used to bring about a global prohibition treaty on the weapon itself. And of course, landmines and cluster munitions are good examples here. After these weapons are deployed, no one can determine who will be killed or mutilated by them. It might be a soldier, but it's more likely to be a civilian just going about their normal daily life. And the two treaties, the Mine Ban Treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, provide a precedent for the prohibition of weapons over which there is inadequate human control, and this lack of human control renders the weapons indiscriminate and therefore illegitimate. And similarly, as Toby mentioned, with biological and chemical weapons, no one can control how far and wide these weapons will spread after they're deployed, who will be killed by them or injured, etc. And they also have been prohibited by treaty. And the most destructive of all, nuclear weapons, were indeed prohibited very recently by the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was adopted by the UN on 7 July last month, and it will be open for signature on the 20th of September. And it will come into force after 50 countries have signed and ratified it, which is probably going to be somewhere in the next year or so. There'll be a huge amount of work ahead, even after this treaty comes into effect, but it's an enormous step forward in the delegitimising and stigmatising of these worst of all weapons. So nuclear weapons are the ultimate dehumanising of armed conflict by the sheer numbers of people whom they kill and mutilate. And the conclusion of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is in fact a huge success story for civil society, because it would not have come about without civil society around the world, working with some governments, but it's been particularly civil society pushing the agenda for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So it shows what's possible by ordinary people working from strong conscience on an issue to bring about very significant global change and a whole change of thinking about a particular weapons system. Nuclear weapons also highlight the risks of relying on technology to perform perfectly every time. Chatham House in the UK, in a report in 2014, listed at least 13 instances since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis when nuclear weapons were very nearly launched, and several of these instances were due to technical malfunction or breakdown in communications, causing false alarms in both the US and in the USSR. And in these instances, catastrophe on a global scale, and I'm sure you can imagine that, was averted by human intervention, that is, individuals gambling that the alarm was in fact a false alarm. We still have about 1,800 nuclear weapons on high alert. It's incredible and it's unconscionable, but that's the reality still. If you haven't seen the film The Man Who Saved the World, it's really worth seeing. It's about an episode in 1983 when Russian early warning monitors saw what they thought was an incoming US nuclear attack. The false alarm was in fact caused by sunlight glinting off US territory, which confused the Russian warning satellites. And the film is about Colonel Stan Petrov, who was in fact the commander in charge of the Russian early warning monitors that particular night. And if there'd been another commander who didn't suspect that this was a false alarm, if there'd been another commander, who knows if we would be here today. And I don't like to over-dramatise things, but that is the reality. There is another episode, 1995, where, again, Russian early warning stations detected what they thought was a US Trident submarine-launched missile attack coming into Russia. But on that occasion, it was in fact a Norwegian weather rocket. And the Norwegian government had notified the Russian government that they were going to be sending up this weather rocket. The message to the Russian government didn't get through to where it needed to get through to, so there was another alarm of what was thought to be an incoming US missile strike. President Yeltsin was alerted on that occasion, and again it was human intervention at the very last minute that prevented global catastrophe in 1995. So I've digressed a bit from killer robots, but the point here is that human judgment can be faulty, but technology can also let us down. So we need the capacity for both humans and technology to have input into decisions that have very grave consequences. And if we abandon either of those, then the scope for error is much greater. I'm going to mention the issue of accountability because fully autonomous weapons raise serious legal concerns in relation to accountability for killing in times of war and peace. Weapons cannot be punished and they cannot be deterred, and a commander could not be held legally accountable for the actions of a weapon over which he or she has no control, even if that weapon commits an unlawful act. So that accountability gap needs to be closed, which means that there must be human control over all weapons systems. And as we know, of course, the very purpose of killer robots is that there is no human control. That's all I'm going to say specifically on topic, and now I'm going to go off topic a little, but to talk about warfare in Australia, because there are serious concerns here, and it fits with what Toby was saying about Australia's very disappointing performance in relation to the issue of killer robots. I'm just going to make a few observations which I think are fairly... You could challenge them if you like, feel free. Anyway, I'm going to make these observations. Australia is continuously at war. We've been at war since 2001. It's the longest period ever, about 16 years that we've been continuously at war, and there's no end in sight. Being at war is becoming the norm for us. We go to war, we prepare for war. Even when the wars we go to are making us less secure, we keep on and on going to war. And Prime Minister Turnbull in the past week or so hasn't given any hope that that is going to change. We build weapons as if they're nothing more than job creation schemes. Whereas if we put the same amount of money into jobs in, say, education, more jobs in education, more jobs in healthcare, public transport, looking after the environment, any sector of society that you like to name, if we put the same amount of money into those sectors, we would in fact, judging by evidence from elsewhere, we would in fact create more jobs. So when you hear about jobs building submarines, jobs building air warfare destroyers or whatever, just ask your local MP, well, how many jobs? Wouldn't we get more jobs if we had better healthcare, better education system? Now, all of this is happening despite the fact that the 2016 Defence White Paper said that the risk of Australia being invaded in the foreseeable future is remote. The 2016 Defence White Paper briefing on defence industry indicated that $195 billion will be spent over a decade for defence capability. $195 billion over a decade. Now, we can't maintain jobs in this country building civilian goods, but we pour tens of billions of dollars into building weapons. Just last year, the Victorian government bought the old Holden site at Fisherman's Bend, where we used to make civilian vehicles. Not that we want more and more cars on the road, but that's not the point. We used to make civilian vehicles. Now that site has been bought to create a site focusing on high-tech development, but particularly weapons. Weapons companies with their own profit-driven agendas are funding school and university programs in our underfunded education system. And the most recent of these was the deal between Lockheed Martin and Melbourne University last year to set up a weapons lab at Melbourne Uni. And it's the first Lockheed Martin weapons lab outside of the United States, and that's at Melbourne University. Now, at the same time that we're doing all of this, our diplomacy is greatly degraded. Funding for our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade goes down relatively, it gets whittled away. And then when areas of tension crop up, like over Korea, we're told war is the only option. Well, we've whittled away all the other options. We don't invest in diplomacy, we don't know how to negotiate. So when we close off all the other options, then war is the only thing that remains. We reduce our choices for dealing with conflict. Our foreign aid, which used to be much more respectable than it is now, and foreign aid can be a very valuable tool for building up good relationships with our neighbours. That is pitiful. It has been reduced over recent years, and it's at quite shamefully low levels now. On the decision to go to war, Australia goes to war with no debate in our parliament. In 2003, one man, Howard, took us to war, a catastrophic war that's got repercussions still in the Middle East. Still, there is no debate in our parliament on any proposal to go to war. We go to war with no strategy, no idea of the end point, no estimate of the costs, the economic costs, no plans for looking after the civilian casualties, including the refugees. No debate about the serious issues involved in the decision to go to war. We're always told it's the biggest decision a country can make, but our parliament does not talk about it. Sometimes there is a debate after the decision is made, but who can say then, no, we don't agree with this decision? Then you're disloyal to the troops. If war is a deployment is criticised after the event. So we go to war simply because our friend the United States is going. In March this year, Senator Ludlam, Scott Ludlam, who's greatly missed from Parliament, he asked the Defence Department in Senate estimates about the total number of casualties of the Iraq War from 2003. And the answer he got from the Defence Department was 27 ADF wounded and 2 non-combat related ADF deaths. The question was about the total number of casualties of the Iraq War from 2003. 2 non-combat related ADF deaths. That's it. So on the extent of non-Australian casualties, our government doesn't know, doesn't care. An estimate from International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War of the Iraqi death toll is around 1 million Iraqis dead, either directly or indirectly, as a result of that war. I'm just going to mention the group Australians for War Powers Reform. You might have a flyer on your table. So if you're interested in the issue of how a decision to go to war in Australia is made and would like some reform on that, please have a look at that group and join us if you'd like. And on nuclear weapons, Toby's quite right that Australia generally has had a fairly good history on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation up until recent years. The recently negotiated treaty, Australia actively tried to undermine and thwart at every opportunity, doing the bidding of the United States. It was totally shameful. And Australia, of course, retains strong support for extended nuclear deterrence, and we preach disarmament to others. So we have really very little credibility on the matter. We haven't mentioned Pine Gap. Pine Gap, as you know, plays a strong role in nuclear weapons targeting, in drone targeting, and in other destabilising activities. So I'm just going to sum up by stating weapons systems need all possible checks and balances to prevent indiscriminate killings, and this requires human input and not just technological analysis of a set of data. So on killer robots, there is a very strong case for the prohibition on these weapons, and I really applaud the work that Toby Walsh and his colleagues and others are doing on this issue. It's extremely important. Other weapons with indiscriminate effects have been banned, and there's a strong case for the same with killer robots. Australia's foreign policy has become heavily militarised and our security weakened in the process. Our addiction to US wars and to technological fixes to conflicts between nations needs to be challenged and reversed, or else we will forever be trying to catch up with the latest killing technology, or else we will be out in front leading the killing technology with no end in sight. I'm just going to mention the number of commentators have compared our situation now to the situation before World War I and the arms races that were taking place then. The fact that all these dreadnoughts were being built, and they were being built supposedly to deter war. They didn't deter war. That was an enormous fraud and a myth, and we're at risk of sleepwalking in the same manner as happened in 1914. We need a strengthening of the peace movement in Australia and as much pressure as possible to keep Australia out of wars which are undermining everybody's security. So thank you very much, and I'm going to give a plug for a number of organisations. ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, Australians for War Powers Reform, you have a brochure there. And I'm going to mention also IPAN, Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, which advocates, as you would think from its name. IPAN is having a conference in Melbourne on the weekend of September 8 to 10. Right. Ah, thank you. Okay. Full program at No, but Sydney folk could organise one. That would be terrific. ipan.org. Verucci Reggio, Mills, speakers from South Korea, Philippines, Diego Garcia, Guam, New Zealand, Alison Bronowski, Scott Ludlam. So if you can get to that, then I think that would be very worthwhile. So, right. Okay. Thank you very much, and I look forward to some questions and discussion.